Happy Sunday, everybody. Today we're asking the question, did the saints really need to come westward to the Salt Lake Valley? Was this part of some foreordained prophecy? Was it part of some practical necessity? How might things have happened differently had the westward migration not taken place? To begin, I want to start with a quote from the History of the Church. This is from Joseph Smith, where he is prophesying about the saints' westward migration to the Rocky Mountains. Here's the quote. I prophesied that the saints would continue to suffer much affliction and would be driven to the Rocky Mountains. Many would apostatize. Others would be put to death by our persecutors or lose their lives in consequence of exposure or disease. And some of you will live to go and assist in making settlements and build cities and see the saints become a mighty people in the midst of the Rocky Mountains. Now, in response to that quote, we might congratulatorily pat ourselves on the back and say, prophecy fulfilled, this is what happened. Look at how great this all is. As is the practice on on this podcast, and especially of late, as I've shared in past months, particularly as it pertains to quotes purported to be from Joseph Smith, we're going to pause and unpack this one a little bit to try and assess whether this quote from Joseph Smith actually came from Joseph Smith. If so, what was the context and the circumstances, rather than simply taking this at full face value without further inquiry. So, here is the image from the history of the church that was being written out by the historians in the church office. You can see the date is 1842, specifically August 6th is where this quote comes from. Now, what may not be apparent at first scan of the image, because, the handwriting is tiny and hard to read and so forth, is that this reference that I just read was a later addition to the written history of the church. Teeny tiny at bottom, different ink, right? Different size, really trying to squeeze in there at the bottom this quote. Why not write it on the next page, right? Why not continue on the next page? Well, it's because here, as you can see on the next page, they already had August 7th at the top and 8th, and they continued on from there. So they had to squeeze this in later on at the very end of August 6th, 1842. Now, this makes sense because this history draft, this written history of the church, was written first between 1845 to 1846. So in the years following the death of Joseph and Hiram, and I've shared in the past Brigham and Wilford Woodruff and Willard Richards and these guys are revising the history, and they're compiling it all, and they're sourcing it from various little papers and tidbits, and they're trying to compile it into this history. So they do this 1845, 1846, and then after they get into the valley and get settled, they pick it back up in 1854 and 1855, almost a decade later, to finalize this history and try and lock it down. Now that is important. This two segment aspect of compiling the history with a decade span in between. That's important for a reason we will see in just a moment. Now, this beautifully written, legible, neat prose history of the church was kind of a final draft, right? There were previous drafts prior to this more finalized version that was being written out. Here is what's called the history draft. This is one of the drafts preparing the history of the church as they were compiling all these sources. The history draft for August 6th, 1842 does not contain this prophecy that I read, the one that was written out kind of, tiny at the bottom. The history draft simply reads, Saturday the 6th, passed over the river to Montrose, Iowa, in company with General James Adams and Colonel James Brewer and others, and witnessed the installation of the offices of the Rising Sun Lodge of the ancient York Masons at Montrose by General James Adams, Deputy Grand Master of Illinois. Now, this document itself, the history draft, was a compilation from separate sources, including Joseph's journal, which we'll see in just a second. Now, the history of the church, that final nice penmanship one, right? It's no surprise that the part of the nice penmanship and what was being written out did not contain the prophecy because it was not in this history draft that we just saw and read from. And so they were compiling and writing out far more neatly the final history of the church based on this draft, and the draft didn't contain the prophecy. Therefore, the history of the church did not either, at least in that first segment when they worked on it, 1845, 1846, before it was being finalized. Again, we'll get to that later portion in just a bit. But as I said, the history draft was based on other sources, including Joseph's journal. The primary basis here, Joseph saying, you know, I passed over the river with these people. I went to this Masonic lodge where they were installing these offices. So here is Joseph's journal for the same date, August 6th, 1842. It says, Saturday the 6th, went over the river to Montrose to witness the installation of officers of the Rising Sun Lodge, Iowa, in company with Colonel Brewer, General James Adams, etc. So this is consistent with what was later included in the history draft. Of course, the history draft adds a little bit more. For example, they say the Rising Sun Lodge, and then add of ancient York Masons, right? And so it's adding just a little bit more detail for context, but it's not substantively changing or let alone adding anything new. So what was in Joseph's journal for this date effectively became what was in the history draft, and thus the final history of the church. And only in that later segment, 1854-55, do we get that tiny little text at the bottom, the addition of this prophecy on that same date, where Joseph himself is not mentioning this, and it's not contained in the history draft. So where did this prophecy, this purported, for now, prophecy, come from? What is the documented source? Well, if you look at the Joseph Smith papers at the history of the church, they footnote it and say that it comes from Anson Call, a statement he made circa 1854 in possession of the church history library. So a statement made by this guy Anson Call around 1854. Who's Anson Call? This guy was baptized in 1836. He moves to far west, then Illinois, moves around Illinois, eventually moves to Nauvoo in 1842. That's September, and about a month after this purported prophecy was given by Joseph, he's called on a mission to Iowa. He serves in the Nauvoo Legion. He is, by the way, a polygamist. He had one wife from 1833 all the way until after Joseph dies, and a few years later marries his first polygamous wife, 1851, and then a handful thereout. Has a total of 25 kids with 4 of 6 of his wives. Later becomes a bishop, a stake president, a representative of the territorial legislature, and he dies in 1890. Now, towards the end of his life, Anson puts together a lot of recollections. In fact, kind of halfway through his life, he starts working on this 1854. So again, he doesn't die for another 35 years. He has some later recollections, but he puts together this effectively autobiography. Around 1854 is when the bulk of it is written. He starts it earlier in life, but the bulk of it is done around 1854, which, of course, is just in time to have something from his journal slipped into the history of the church, which was being worked on between 1854 and 1855. Now, the fact that it wasn't written in the history draft suggests, I think, even further that it was a super latecomer for inclusion, published just prior to that mid-1850s revision, right? Because they've got things pretty well locked down, but they're, this guy Anson Call said that he heard Joseph say this, so let's include it in teeny tiny penmanship, at the bottom of the page. This set of recollections, this autobiography by Anson Call, is published by his descendants in TypeScript format, where they take a page of his autobiography and then they have the transcribed page. And so I downloaded the full thing, read through it, trying to hunt down where in this statement do we get this purported prophecy. The descendants who published the autobiography, and I'll share the actual quote from his record in just a moment. These descendants, they write the following at the beginning of the published autobiography. They say, Anson's journal has been prevaricatively referred to as a reminiscent account written years later, or as a biography. Although it is true that Anson made various corrections and additions to the journal in later years, it is almost certain that the first half of the journal was recorded by or before 1856. This being true, the journal is a valuable reference source concerning the famous Rocky Mountain prophecy, the transformation of Brigham Young into the likeness of the prophet Joseph Smith, the circumstances surrounding the plot to take the prophet Joseph's life and his subsequent martyrdom, the Siegel miracles, and other events of historical significance. Okay, so, that's pretty remarkable, right? One guy is the source for so many of these things, or a source for so many of these amazing things that he wrote down a decade later. So again, that just introduces this low question and speculation of if it's not truly contemporary, how well can we trust it? Of course, here the descendants are getting a little defensive and saying, oh, some people refer to it as a reminiscent account written years later or as a biography. But they go on later to say, oh, but we think this is pretty close to contemporaneous because he wrote it in the bulk of it in the 1850s. Well, sorry, that's still a decade after, this purported, more than a decade after this purported prophecy was given. Let's get into said prophecy. Now, the context here is that in Anson Call's autobiography, he says the wrong date. Again, remember from the history and from Joseph's journal, we were talking about August 6th, 1842. In Anson Call's autobiography, he puts the date as July 14th, 1843, almost 1 year later. And he says in here, we crossed the river to be present at the installment of a lodge of the Masonic Order. So that portion alone matches the August 6th entry for Willard Richards in Joseph's journal in a history draft. So it's likely that Willard Richards' draft is accurate, having kept a somewhat day-to-day record of Joseph's activities, whereas Anson's decade-later recollection is what got the date wrong. So if he's already off by a year, and naming, by the way, a specific date, he's not saying sometime in, 1843, he's saying July 14th, 1843. So that alone starts to introduce this question of how much can we rely on this if he's off by a year when naming a very specific date. Here's the quote. Whilst together, Joseph, who was with us, told us of many things that should transpire in the mountains. After drinking a draught of ice water, he said, Brethren, this water tastes much like the crystal streams that are running in the Rocky Mountains, which some of you will participate of. There are some of those standing here that will perform a great work in that land, pointing to Shadrach Roundy and a number of others whom I have forgotten. There is Anson. He shall go and assist in building cities from one end of the country to the other, and you shall perform as great a work as has ever been done by man, so that the nations of the earth shall be astonished, and many of them will be gathered in that land, assisting in building cities and temples, and Israel shall be made to rejoice. But before you see this day, you will pass through scenes that are but little understood by you. This people will be made to mourn, multitudes will die, and many will apostatize. But the priesthood shall prevail over all its enemies, triumph over the devil, and be established upon the earth, never more to be thrown down. He then charged us with all the zeal and language a prophet could muster, to be faithful in those things that had been and should be committed to our charge, with the promise of all the blessings that the priesthood could bestow. Remember these things and treasure them up. Amen. Okay. Now again, let me read the version that appears in the official history to see how different it is. That reads again, I prophesy that the saints would continue to suffer much affliction and would be driven to the Rocky Mountains. Many would apostatize, and others would be put to death by our persecutors, or lose their lives in consequences of exposure or disease. And some of you will live to go and assist in making settlements and build cities and see the saints become a mighty people in the midst of the Rocky Mountains. These are very different statements, and yet the only citation that we have, the basis for its inclusion in the official history of the church, which was not in the draft and was not in the journal, was this late inclusion from a statement made in the published autobiography of Anson Call just in time for the history of the church to be published. And the editors of said history, the historians, felt sufficiently trustworthy of Anson Call that they could rely on this sole claim of this decade plus later recollection, repackaging Anson Call's statement in the first person, Joseph saying, I prophesied that the saints would da-da-da-da-da, right? And recasting this claim and this recollection from Anson Call into Joseph in the first person directly saying these things, when the words are substantively different in many ways from what was in Anson Call's statement. Decades later, 1916, we're in General Conference. Orson Whitney is talking. He shares this quote. Elder Whitney says that the prophet Joseph Smith voiced a great prediction, which you and I are now helping to fulfill, a prediction fulfilled in part by our parents and grandparents who came to the Rocky Mountains to build up these stakes of Zion. I will read to you just what the prophet said on that occasion. At Nauvoo, Illinois, under date of August 6, 1842, he made this entry in his journal. And then Elder Whitney, Orson Whitney, goes on to quote the official history paragraph that I just reread. Now, it's important here, a couple things. First, Elder Whitney says, I will read to you just what the prophet said. Just what the prophet said, implying a verbatim statement from the prophet's own mouth, which is not at all the case. This is a decade-plus later recollection, and then that recollection is repackaged into this first-person narrative from Joseph. Also, Elder Whitney saying that on August 6, 1842, he, Joseph, made this entry in his journal. Even if we concede that that's just a looser way of saying his scribes made the entry in his journal, because Joseph rarely wrote in his own journal. It was always the scribes kind of saying, here's what happened and what Joseph said. So even if we're a little loose with our terms and say, oh, the scribes made this entry in his journal, that's still not true. This was not in Joseph's journal. And then Elder Whitney, after making that wrongful claim, goes on to share a much longer statement of the same prophecy from Anson Call, written decades later when he's an old man. So he does this mid-1850s version in his autobiography, and then decades later he's an old guy and he's expounding on it and beefing it up. It has similar details to the original. Of course, he had a written version of his own autobiography for reference. He's not just totally going off of memory. Therefore, the later recollection somewhat tracks the earlier one, but it has a lot more color to it. For example, he says later in his life, while Joseph was talking, his countenance changed to white, not the deadly white of a bloodless face, but a living, brilliant white. He seemed absorbed in gazing at something at a great distance, and said, I am gazing upon the valleys of those mountains. So here he's saying Joseph is actively seeing this in vision while Anson Call happens to be present. Of course, that was not in the original, and now it's decades and decades later, not just a single decade. Now, I should state here that Anson Call by no means is the only individual to have made this claim to a prophecy by Joseph about the saints fleeing and migrating to the Rocky Mountains. Let's look at a few of these. There's Benjamin Johnson, for example, who said, and I quote, before this, the prophet had foreshadowed the close of his own earthly mission and the near approach of the time when the saints in tribulation would find a place of refuge in the far-off vales of the Rocky Mountains, which has already taken place. Now, when you research this issue online, you might stumble upon FAIR, which is a group of apologists for the church. I don't even remember what their name stands for now. I don't remember, but they're apologists for the church, right? And there's a lot of good stuff there. I often agree with what they're publishing against some of the, critics of the church, and they can do sometimes very good historical, research. But they and so many church historians are so willing to grant these individuals a claim of accuracy and integrity simply because they claim that Joseph said this thing, and they'll conclusively say Joseph said this or Joseph did that, when they're relying on decades later recollections and elevating those to be on par with like a contemporaneous record or something, more significant. So this is where I feel like these apologists and historians often break down in their intellectual integrity, is by not calling to attention the problematic, or not even, because that's implying inherently a negative, but the I don't know, the challenging nature of these quotes, and that we shouldn't just take them at face value. We should, pause and kind of assess whether these later recollections are actually true or not. So, for example, some of these quotes I pulled right from the FAIR page and then went and dug up the the original citations. Benjamin Johnson, in saying this, Fair did not tell their readers on the website that he wrote this in his autobiography half a century later. They did say in the Fair article, oh, these are later recollections, but they don't give any details, making it seem like it could be just a few years. This was half a century later that Benjamin Johnson is saying, oh, Joseph, said that the saints in tribulation would find a place of refuge in the far-off vales of the Rocky Mountains. Half a century. That doesn't mean it's wrong, by the way. I mean, those of you older folks, listening right now, you can no doubt recall things early in your life. Granted, as humans, we all then start introducing bias and perceptions and thinking things were said. I even have this problem just months ago, thinking that I said something a certain way to my, wife or a colleague at work. My kids will tell you that 3 days ago I told them something a little bit different, so that when I'm trying to enforce this, that's not how you said it before, right? We're all guilty of this. This is a part of our human condition, the way our brains work. And so here we are dealing with quotes half a century later. Let's go to another one that Fair and a lot of these people will share. This is Wandel Mace. He says, these things did not come upon us unexpectedly, at least to those who were watching the signs of the times. The prophet Joseph had told us that many of us would live to go to the Rocky Mountains and there become a mighty people. Therefore, we were looking forward to this time. Well, again, like Benjamin Johnson, this quote from Wandel Mace was also written in his autobiography half a century later. Another quote we get purporting to validate the authenticity of Joseph actually saying this and sharing this with the saints comes from Samuel Richards. Quote says, in the winter of 1843 and 44, a messenger came and asked me if I would be one of a party to go and explore the Rocky Mountains with 23 other men, to find a place where the church could be established. He, Joseph Smith, relating a vision in which he saw the valleys of the mountains, California and northern Mexico, and then the building of a temple at Jackson County, Missouri, and the earth redeemed and filled with towns and villages and producing all that was necessary for the sustenance of men. Where does this quote, dear reader, come from? This comes from Anthony Ivan's journal in 1905, Anthony Ivans claiming that this is what Samuel told him half a century after the fact. So just a few years prior or whatever to Anthony Ivans, including in his journal. So now we're getting a secondhand recollection over half a century later. And this quote is offered up by those who want to say, look, Joseph was really teaching this. I mean, maybe. Again, in all of this, I'm not saying here conclusively, Joseph did not prophesy that the saints would go west to the Rocky Mountains. That is not my contention. But if we're going to assume that what is in the history of the church and this claim to prophecy is true, it should stand up to scrutiny. And when you start to scrutinize some of this stuff and the way that the apologists are trying to elevate these half a century later quotes, you begin to start to question a little bit of the veracity of these underlying claims. Brigham Young himself said, in the days of Joseph, we have sat many hours at a time conversing about this very country, meaning the West. Joseph has often said, if I were only in the Rocky Mountains with 100 faithful men, I would then be happy and ask no odds of mobocrats. Brigham concludes, and neither do I. He said that in 1864. 24 years later after this purported prophecy. And, some claim that, Joseph didn't just say it that one time. He was telling other saints, because there were a lot of people who kind of talked about the Rocky Mountains and talked about, moving west. Therefore, Joseph was talking to a lot of people about it, as Brigham Young here is claiming that for hours at a time we would converse about the Rocky Mountains and this area in the west. But again, 1864. They're already in the West. Brigham is now trying to validate, especially against competing claims of Mormons from other sects or no sect that stayed behind and chose not to go west. They're having to puff their chests and say, we made the right decision. We're guided by God. And so you may possibly have the introduction of some bias and some attempts to fashion a history that may not have actually existed. Orson Pratt, quote, was it upon our own natural judgment that we came to the valley? No. We founded our expectation upon that which God had spoken in the modern revelations which he had given to us as a people. He told us by revelation, before our prophet was martyred, that we would have to leave the United States, go beyond the Rocky Mountains, and seek our home in the wilderness, and that we would have a great people gather with us. Orson Pratt said that in 1880, 4 decades later. This purported revelation does not exist. There's a claim to the prophecy that was included in the history of the church at the last minute in 1854 from Anson Call, but we don't have record that I know of, that I could find, that I could see anyone claiming, other than Orson Pratt, to a revelation that was given. In fact, Orson Pratt says revelations in the plural. Right? We founded our expectation upon that which God had spoken in the modern revelations about purportedly going westward to the Rocky Mountains. 1880 is when we get that one. Then they offer up Mosiah Hancock as another example. Here's the quote. The prophet came to our home and stopped in our carpenter's shop. When I got my map for him, he said, "Now I will show you the travels of this people." He then showed our travels through Iowa and said, "Here you will make a place for the winter. And here you will travel west until you come to the valley of the Great Salt Lake. You will build cities to the north and to the south and to the east and to the west, and you will become a great and wealthy people in that land." I've talked about Mosiah Hancock before. You may recall then, this was from an autobiography written half a century later. Mosiah was born in 1834. He was 8 years old when Anson Call said that Joseph gave this prophecy. Now, Mosiah Hancock is attesting to a different experience of his own, with Joseph showing a map, right? But Mosiah was 10 years old when Joseph died. And so we don't have from Mosiah a claim to a specific year in which this happened, but presumably it was the early 1840s. So Mosiah is like 6 to 10 years old and claiming that when I got my map for Joseph, here's the things that Joseph verbatim said in reply. And I remember this half a century later, verbatim of what he said when I was an 8-year-old or what. Like, give me a break, right? Let's do one, maybe two more. This is from Paulina Lyman. I first came across this from a BYU religion professor publishing in I think it was a Deseret News article. He said that in 1832, while in Jackson County, Missouri, the prophet Joseph Smith gathered a group of children together in the Lyman and Harriet White home and blessed them. Paulina Eliza Phelps, later Lyman, this woman to which I referred, Paulina, who was 5 at the time, later recalled, quote, and this is from Paulina's later recollection, "In blessing me, he said that I should live to go to the Rocky Mountains. I did not know at the time what the term Rocky Mountains meant, but I supposed it to be something connected with the Indians. This frightened me for the reason that I dreaded the very sight of an Indian." Paulina attested to this memory in 1903. She was allegedly, of course, 5 years old at the time, as this BYU religion professor claimed, elevating her quote as, here's another example of Joseph prophesying about this. No critical scrutiny at all, just another faith-promoting, evidence, if you will. But she signed this affidavit in 1903. This was 71 years later. Whew. Okay, final one. Claudius Spencer. This one I had to hunt down, because the same BYU religion professor I just mentioned in his article shared a snippet of this quote that I could not find anywhere. It took me a while to hunt this down. This was not in the Fair article and not in a lot of places. Here is the quote. "I am a living witness that Joseph predicted in Nauvoo," and then now he's quoting Joseph, "My people shall become a numerous and a mighty host in the vastness of the Rocky Mountains." When those words were spoken, they would have tested the credulity of any man of the world, as there was not the least likelihood of their fulfillment at that time. Okay, the vastness of the Rocky Mountains. My people shall become a numerous and a mighty host. This guy, Claudius Spencer, claims to have heard, it says he's a living witness to Joseph saying these words verbatim. Now, the only source I could find anywhere, I had to hunt this down, was from a book called Remembering Joseph, Personal Recollections of Those Who Knew the Prophet Joseph Smith. This was compiled in 2003 by Mark McConkie, who is Bruce McConkie's, or was, he passed away, but Bruce McConkie's son. Now, Claudius Spencer, said this in the late 1890s. Again, half a century later. He was 18 years old, by the way, in 1842 when the Anson Call Purported Prophecy happened. So he's a teenager, late teenager around this time. He's sharing this late in the 1890s, half a century later, and then McConkie scoops it into this book, Remembering Joseph, and it gets included as this quote. In fact, there's a statue that looks like I deleted this from my notes. There was a statue that was put up in Nauvoo of Joseph and Brigham looking westward, and they have these plans right here, the plans for going to Rocky Mountain, and it's meant to depict Joseph telling Brigham, "Hey, you're going to be going westward. Here's what you need to do. Here's where you need to go." And this definite like furthering the kind of Brigham claim to authority and all of that, right? Joseph and Brigham united talking about going to the Rocky Mountains. And then they recreated that same statue to put at, this is the place, Heritage Park here in Utah, where, Brigham is famed for saying, this is the right place, carry on. And then they descended into the valley below. So up at that park, you have another statue, Joseph and Brigham and the plans, and I think it's called Eyes Westward. And at the base of that statue, they have this quote that I just read from Claudius Spencer: "My people shall become a numerous and a mighty host in the vastness of the Rocky Mountains." Again, just a claim half a century later from a guy who was a late teenager at the alleged time of Joseph saying this, and yet it is now what is put on statues and put in newspaper articles and in books like this one containing personal recollections. Now, I want to give a shout out here to Mark McConkie, because when I first started reading this book, I thought, oh, here we go. A bunch of recollections years and decades later. Probably many of these I've already read, but like that particular quote I had never come across before. But these are all these reminiscences later on, and I'm just increasingly developing this initial skepticism about the validity of a lot of these things, because again, you could develop a lot of street cred, spiritual and otherwise, by saying, oh, Joseph once told me this, or I heard Joseph say this, or for those who are in authority, being able to bolster their authority and defend their own doctrinal innovations, cough, Brigham, by saying, hey, Joseph taught me this, or I heard Joseph once privately say X, right? So there's a lot of that going on because this was the prophet. Just like a lot of saints were sealing themselves to Joseph, men and women, right, through the law of adoption and trying to get connected to Joseph. There was a lot of kind of power and relational benefit to doing so. So I crack open this book from Mark McConkie and thinking, okay, we're going to get a lot of quotes like this. And to his credit, what I read in the preface was the following, which directly relates to this topic. He said, both the problems and the promise of recording memories and the memories of others are captured in an editorial written by Joseph F. Smith in the Improvement Era of March 1898. In response to the question of whether it was advisable to gather individual testimony from our aged brethren who've been faithful in the cause of truth, and also from our elders who return home from time to time from missions and who are full of the spirit of their callings, Joseph F. Smith wrote, and here's now the quote from President Smith, "We see no impropriety in brethren gathering individual testimonies concerning the truth, either from the aged brethren or from the elders returning from missions. On the contrary, we believe that the testimonies of our aged brethren who knew the prophet Joseph Smith and other early leaders, elders and leaders of the church ought to be secured and carefully recorded, provided, of course, that the circumstances are well authenticated and carefully and accurately stated. We fear that many things that are reported as coming from the prophet Joseph Smith and other early elders in the church, by not being carefully recorded or told with strict regard for accuracy, have lost something of their value as historical data, and unwarranted additions have sometimes been made to the original facts, until it is difficult to determine just how far some of the traditions which have come to us may be accepted as reliable representations of what was said or what was done. Let those who feel impressed to make a record of facts, as they become acquainted with them, do so. But let them exercise the greatest care in obtaining accuracy of statement, and in giving the authority for the statements they record." Bravo. Amen. Hallelujah. Could not agree more with what was just said. McConkie goes on after this to share how his own father, Elder Bruce McConkie, was frequently frustrated that members of the church were attributing to him certain statements that he never said. He was kind of venting in a letter to his son, Mark, who compiled this book, how he would go to these, church conferences and people would claim things. And he said even sometimes, like, they'd have a conference on a Saturday, and then the next Sunday, the stake president or someone would be saying, as Elder McConkie said yesterday, blah, blah, blah. And Elder McConkie in his letter to his son was like, I didn't say that thing. They're like one day later misrepresenting what I said, let alone people who are claiming that I said or did things years ago. So Mark had a little bit, through his father, of a personal experience to substantiate what President Joseph F. Smith was here talking about. McConkie added, quote, some of the recollections contained in this volume were given when the storytellers were quite old. Memory, of course, often dims with age. One classic illustration of this problem comes from the remembrances of David Lewis, who at age 90 sat down with 5 members of the church historian staff and shared his recollections of his early days in the church, including his involvement in the organization of the church of April 6, 1830, when he was 12 years of age. At some points in the interview, he forgets a point or cannot recall another, and members of the historian's staff volunteer information, which he then confirms. Is that his memory at play, or the memory of one of the church historians? And what would have happened had the historian's staff not been there to prod that 90-year-old memory? And more to the point, what does this episode suggest in the instances of aging memories of people who lacked the beneficial prod of the church historian's office? What was lost or altered? And McConkie goes on further to elaborate on this point. So I applaud him for being that forthright in the introduction to his own book, which includes all of these later recollections and reminiscences. He's basically undercutting the presumed accuracy and validity and encouraging the reader to not take things at face value, which in a, publication like this, sold at Deseret News and said to be Joseph Smith, most people would probably just go ahead and take at face value and say, look, Joseph said and did all these things. So I want to give a huge shout out to this McConkie fellow, because putting that in the introduction to his own book, I think is powerful. Now, it's funny to me, right? Joseph F. Smith, I should have before this, let's see, 1898. Okay, so 1898. Here's what's crazy to me about this great response from Joseph F. Smith, right? Wants to make sure the circumstances are well authenticated, carefully and accurately stated. We fear that many things reported as coming from Joseph, by not being carefully recorded with strict regard for accuracy, we've lost something. And I bold and underline this part, unwarranted additions have sometimes been made to the original facts until it's difficult to determine just how far some of the traditions which have come to us may be accepted as reliable representations of what was said or what was done. And yet this individual himself was the one who wrote all of the affidavits for the women who were claiming that they were, quote, sealed or married to Joseph. Joseph F. Smith trying to defend against his cousins in the RLDS church and their claims that, Joseph had not taught or practiced polygamy. Joseph F. Smith, like the church historians in McConkie's example, was prodding, and he would be the one in his own book to write these affidavits saying, oh, this lady told me this, but it's all Joseph F. Smith writing it down and then having these ladies just sign it, and then oftentimes they didn't even sign it. And yet people claim that woman said said this thing because it comes from Joseph F. Smith. So he, I think, is a bit guilty of the very thing that he's decrying here, which I find to be interesting. But the point still stands, and I still applaud it, right? I think unwarranted additions have been made, and we have these traditions that have come to us, and we need to question whether they're a reliable representation of what was said and what was done, even though he may himself, Joseph F. Smith, have imperfectly abided by that same standard. I think it's a good standard. And I think it is the basis for scrutinizing some of these purported prophecies and alleged quotes from Joseph Smith. So the thing here with the Salt Lake expedition, I mean, we can assume that Joseph said it, and maybe some of these recollections are a little bit fuzzy or generous with the details, but still fundamentally accurate because Joseph was talking about it. So that could be an assumption. We could also assume that the opposite is true, that Joseph never actually said that these were later recreations of memory and a desire to validate Brigham's decision to take everyone westward. I have no skin in the game here, no dog in this fight. I'm completely comfortable with both. I just don't think that we can, like Elder Orson Whitney, read the history of the church and say Joseph said this verbatim in his own words. He wrote it in his journal, right? No, that was a late addition from Anson Call, who a decade after the fact claimed that he heard Joseph say this. And then other people, decades after that, including Anson Call himself, are claiming to remember all kinds of other things. I think that's a little questionable, and appropriately so. Now, many saints, of course, stayed behind. So this notion that the saints had to flee westward because of all the persecution and the mobs and everything else, like, there was definitely persecution, there was definitely mobs, there was definitely an extermination order as things, heated up with the governor. But some 10 to 20,000 Latter-day Saints stayed behind. Like some estimates suggest around a fifth of all the Latter-day Saints, especially those who weren't already clustered living together. There were a lot of saints out in branches and scattered throughout the East. And so you did not have this mass migration from the vast majority. Clearly a sizable majority of the saints went westward, but, Emma and others and plenty of Latter-day Saints stayed put. And so my own musing here is that the reason why Brigham and the other leaders felt like they needed to go west, number one, again, I'll concede, maybe there was this prophecy and they were operating based on what Joseph said, and now it was manifesting and coming true. Like, that's certainly a plausible thing. I just don't think the quotes and the information we have, to me, are a reliable basis to conclusively agree with that point. So I don't, without further evidence to substantiate it. So it's possible that Brigham and others were just going off, hey, Joseph said we're going to have to do it, and here's the persecution, so now it's time to go fulfill that prophecy. Onward, westward we go. But I think fundamentally it was an issue of concentrated power. This theocracy that was, or theodemocracy that was being created. And then you had the Council of 50, right? And Joseph effectively being anointed as king in a way, and these claims of total political authority. Joseph being mayor of Nauvoo, having a captured, council of loyalists, and the Nauvoo Legion, right? So they were often fighting against the charter that they got for Nauvoo because they had this kind of self-sovereign grant of authority. And then as they grew, a lot of the neighbors didn't like that. There were bills in the legislature that Joseph Smith's younger brother, who was a member of it, boldly often fought against to try and preserve the Nauvoo Charter. The neighbors didn't like that Mormons were being elected. They wanted their people. This was the basis for the Missouri War when you first had the conflict. I talked about that some weeks ago at the voting, at the booth, when this physical altercation broke out. It was over the electoral chances of the locals wanted their non-Mormon guy to get elected. And so with the saints gathering in one location, that of necessity created political conflict with neighbors who did not want to be governed by Mormons, and who felt like their growing numbers, because they were going all over Europe and the eastern states and bringing all these people into a very concentrated locale, was a threat to themselves, to their way of life, to their livelihoods, to their property. And so, as important as gathering was, and commanded by God, of course, it came with problems. And so one, question in my mind is like, okay, if many of the saints stayed behind when they were no longer so concentrated, you didn't have these ongoing persecutions of like one-off Mormons. Like, sure, people would make fun of them or call them Mormonites or steal from them occasionally, but it was like super minor that any random Mormon in the mountainside would be the subject of persecution. It was when they were together and clustered together. And so I just wonder, what would it have been like to decentralize a little bit and spread the saints out, still gather in a roughly broad, area, but intermingle, just like nowadays, right? You have saints spread all over the place, some more concentrated than others, like here in Utah where I'm at. But by spreading out amongst the populace, you diffuse those concerns of political concentration of political power, and, theocratic rule, like you get allegations of in Utah, where the legislature won't go against the church if the church wants something. Another little point is, I think it's a different thing to fill the Rocky Mountains than it is to flee there. This prophecy idea of you will flee, you will have a western migration, versus you will one day fill the Rocky Mountains. Here's this, again, alleged quote of Joseph Smith. You've probably heard this before. Brethren, I have been very much edified. This is after Zion's camp. Edified and instructed in your testimonies. But I want to say that you know no more concerning the destinies of this church and kingdom than a babe upon its mother's lap. It is only a handful of priesthood you see here tonight, but this church will fill North and South America. It will fill the world. It will fill the Rocky Mountains. So here's another mention of the Rocky Mountains. Now this one's a little, different, perhaps. It's because the church will fill North and South America. Of course, the church has used this in its promotional videos and stuff. Look at this great prophecy, and then look at the church now, spreading throughout the world. Again, a word of caution here. This quote is a reminiscence from Wilford Woodruff 60 years later, 6 decades. So again, I get a little squirrely about this direct quote verbatim from Joseph that over half a century Wilford came up with no known contemporaneous source to back it up. But even if it's true, let's even just concede for a moment that Wilford had a perfect recollection that Joseph said these things. Here Joseph is just saying that the church would fill North America and South America. And then, of course, by necessity, it would fill the Rocky Mountains and fill the world. So to say that, maybe Joseph was prophesying and saying one day the saints, will grow so large that you'll go westward because we need to grow and spread out. And so you'll fill the Rocky Mountains, you'll fill South America. Like, that's totally understandable from Joseph to be saying something like that. Well, of course, this is the stone cut out of hands without mountains. This is going to roll forth. No banner shall be unfurled, or whatever that one quote is that we all said as missionaries, right? Now, like the Latter-day Saint newspaper, the Evening and the Morning Star, for example, described the far west, the section of country from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, as the region blessed by the Lord as the land of Zion. So there was this definite idea at the time that Zion includes this westward expansionist sentiment, right? And so, fine, it's one thing to just constantly expand and go fill those places and spread in grow in numbers. It's another thing to say, oh, we need to relocate the entire body of the saints. And by the way, Joseph said that would happen. Where maybe Joseph was just saying the church will one day grow so big and the gospel will roll on so successfully that we'll fill all these places, including the Rocky Mountains. So from that angle, it's possible that Joseph was talking about the Rocky Mountains, but in the context of future church growth, and not in this prophecy that people later reverse engineered of, oh, Joseph said this was going to happen, because remember, he talked about the Rocky Mountains. So he said, one day that will be the case. Part of me, as I read through the history of the church, including the portion that I just shared, as I read through the new saints, which I find so funny that you get all these church talks and Come Follow Me Now, that in their citations for various quotes, they're citing saints, just as they were before citing history of the church. Well, these citations are helpful from a research standpoint to go hunt after the original source, but they themselves are in no way, shape, or form the original source. So you have to dig these layers deeper. But often church historians, even, and apologists and lay members of the church don't. They rely on the simple citation to the history of the church or to the saints as the authoritative text, and then they move on relying on the credibility of that source. But that's not the source. It's just this repackaged thing. And so we have to look at and question church history. I would be fascinated to get a version of church history that only includes things that Joseph said, that either were published contemporarily, that Joseph himself obviously could have reviewed or refuted or anything if there were issues, right? So get it like a contemporaneous record. Or you could say, let's include things after Joseph's death, provided there are two or three corroborating witnesses. This gets into the Joseph F. Smith quote about authenticating things well, carefully and accurately stating them, having a strict regard for accuracy, right? Things like that. And so, of course, the scriptures talk frequently about out of the mouth of two or three witnesses shall all truth be established. I'm not going to read through them all, but I've got compiled here a whole bunch of quotes throughout the Bible talking about in the mouth of two or three witnesses shall every word be established, as it says, for example, in 2 Corinthians. Of course, this doesn't guarantee truth, right? Two or three people all concurring and agreeing with something or whatnot, right? I don't think that everything that two or three people agree upon or validate is therefore truthful. I see that as a bare minimum before even considering a claim to be credible. And so perhaps this new church history project could include things after Joseph's death, provided that there were these, at a minimum, multiple witnesses. So like the Anson Call thing and others, start to get filtered out if you don't have other people, multiple people, because Anson Call said he was there. Remember, he got the date wrong by almost a year, but he said he was there as Joseph was traveling across the river to go to the Masonic Lodge, and that others were there as well. So it's like, well, if others who were present could testify to that fact or record it in their journal or whatever, maybe then we can include Anson Call's decade later recollection if it could be substantiated. Now, of course, all these people are dead, so you can't go to them and say, hey, did you hear Joseph say this too? And prod them like the church historians in Mark McConkie's example, right? But at a bare minimum, I think we would need this multiplicity of corroborating witnesses in order to include something after Joseph's death, because it was so easy and likely so tempting to claim that Joseph said or did something when he in fact did not. Joseph F. Smith himself conceding that very point decades later and expressing a little frustration with how many things had crept into the official history that were not in fact historically accurate. Now, the witnesses, I think, need to attest to a specific date and specific circumstances. Like there would have to be this bar rather than, oh, they all said this. Like they'd have to, much like if you're doing a criminal investigation and you're trying to like interrogate witnesses, and if you can realize, oh, he just saw the other person post online and they were claiming that was their memory, right? You have to look into these things, because when the dates don't line up, when the facts don't match, then the claims by these witnesses start to fall apart, which is why the gold standard, of course, is the contemporaneous record while Joseph is alive, and why I've, as you know, obviously by now, have started to develop a deep initial skepticism for anything after Joseph's death. And I'm open to, of course, this was, not everyone kept a journal. Joseph was doing way more than what was being recorded. I'm not saying that every claim made after Joseph was dead is fake, but I agree with Joseph F. Smith. I think a lot of things crept in after the fact, some well-meaning, others not, claiming that Joseph said or did certain things, and therefore we need to have accuracy. We need to have historical integrity. So maybe Joseph prophesied that the saints would have to flee westward. Perhaps, though, it was just part of a broader vision that he had of the church growing so much that it was sprawling across the land and filling, westward territories as American expansionism was increasingly pushing westward, and that the saints would be part of that and later fill the Rocky Mountains. Hard to say. However, I think the takeaway that I have from this exercise, and I hope that you do as well, is that we shouldn't rely on the repackaged histories of the church, whether the originals or the New Saints versions, as the basis for our text. It is worth digging into the details. It is worth, and thank you to the Joseph Smith papers that makes a lot of this much more feasible. Of course, for a lot of these, this research, I used their resources, or BYU had a lot of scanned stuff. I even found like Anson Call's autobiography on Family Search that some descendant had just scanned and uploaded the full PDF. So it's great to have these resources to be able to investigate and be able to inquire, to try and assess, is this true? Because this is the founding prophet. He's got like a lot of SWAT, right? If Joseph said something, then people have this high degree of, they lend it a high degree of credibility, because look at Joseph's record, look at his fruits, look at all the things he did. He was a prophet. So if he said X, then X must have been accurate and true, and in this case, a true prophecy. Hence the reason why all these people, I think, in retrospect, were so freewheeling with saying Joseph said or did something to bolster that point. But all the more reason, I think, like Joseph F. Smith said, that we need to have some skepticism. That's my word, not his. But we need to be very cautious about what we claim that Joseph said or what he did. And especially when we look at the history of the church and there's this late addition that sneaks in just before the finish line. And there's only one individual who's the basis for this purported prophecy. And he said it, wrote it a decade plus after the fact. Again, the questions start to come in. And at least for me, lead me to a position of saying, I don't think Joseph said that. I'm going to take the position that he didn't say that verbatim. He likely, didn't say that in substance, but perhaps there was something else going on that Anson Call ran with and claimed a decade after Joseph is there to not be able to invalidate or respond to it. But perhaps Joseph was talking about the Rocky Mountains, maybe just in a little bit different context that was being misconstrued, such that when later on Brigham and others decided, hey, we're going to the Rocky Mountains so that we can continue to have our theocracy and we could continue to be polygamous and we can get away from these people who hate our concentrated political power and the new plural marriage system that was going public amongst the saints and elsewhere, right? Could have been tempting to say, oh yeah, Joseph said we're going to go westward, so here we go, right? I don't know. And this is just amusing. I'm not here to conclusively say that at no point did Joseph Smith predict and prophesy that a westward migration of the main body of the saints would happen. But again, the fact that so many of them stayed behind, some of them affiliating later on with the RLDS church that was formed, I think in like 1860, so years later, or other branches thereof, or just becoming kind of an independent Mormon. These people weren't persecuted. They remained where they were once, Brigham and this kind of polygamous, theo-democratic group of individuals got out of Dodge to go live in Mexico and what is now Utah, right? That problem, that persecution dissipated and you didn't really have it, which to me suggests maybe there was a way to keep the saints gathered there, spread them out a little bit, and try and decentralize and abate some of those concerns from neighbors. Maybe not. I'm not an armchair quarterback. I'm not going to say, had they done this, then everything would have been fine. I don't know. It's just interesting speculation on my part. I'd love to know your thoughts, your comments. Is any of this new to you? Do you know of anything else that I missed? Please, as always, share in the comments on the YouTube version to engage in the discussion. I'll see you there, and I'll see you next week.